Hello, everybody. This is Amy from Humility and Doxology. I hope you are having a lovely end of July. We have not started back to school yet, but this was the week that I told the kids, let's get used to setting our alarms again, getting up. Let's go over our new morning time memory work routine in the morning. Look at the new updated chore chart, things like that. So it's sort of one last week to get through that more painful part of revamping our body clocks and getting used to a new chore chart before we officially resume, school next Monday. So I wanted to be able to come on and do this Facebook Live. My friend Mary with Not Before 7 had been asking and encouraging me to talk a little bit about reading journals for our older children, because I have written a post about first reading journals and sort of introducing that practice and that habit with your younger children in a very easy, low-key, loving, non-tear producing, hopefully, way. So I have put a link to the post in the notes here in the description, and there's a free printable there for a first reading journal. If you have children who are competent readers, are beginning to be able to copy 1 or 2 words at a time, or who want to be able to practice some of that from their independent reading, or even the reading you're doing aloud, that is a great tool. I used a similar setup last year with my 2nd grader, and this upcoming year, my 3rd grader will definitely be using that regularly. She has been a little bit later with some of the reading and writing, so it's still perfectly sufficient for her in 3rd grade. And then my 1st grader, who loves to be like her big sister, will be using that as well. And I will just show you, while I wait to see if anyone else pops on, I will show you here an example of, so this was one that she did last year. She read something about science. So you can see she found some key words, she copied a phrase or a sentence, and she drew a picture from her reading. So that's my first reading journal. But you may look at that and that looks fairly basic. There's 5 individual words, there's 1 copied sentence, and you think, well, that's great for your elementary age kids, but what does this start looking like when you're talking about, possibly a more advanced, later elementary, or certainly middle school, high school student? And so that is what I'm going to talk to you about today. I have examples from both of my older children, my son, who is a rising 8th grader, and my daughter, who is a rising 6th grader. And I also have a very embarrassing special treat for you. I have some examples from my own high school reading journal when I was a homeschooled high schooler. So I had actually torn that out of a notebook to save space, but I did mark a few excerpts that I will read blushingly. But that kind of will give you an example of late elementary all the way up to high school, like what this exactly looks like. So a little bit about why I use a reading journal. If you have been around for any length of time or read anything on my blog, you know that I'm not a big fan of worksheets or necessarily, I guess, textbooky textbooks, by which I mean a book that just gives you a dry paragraph and then you answer a series of comprehension questions. That's not our style. We do use a few textbooks, primarily, we use a math textbook, but even for our science, we'll have some sort of core text that is a book, but we really use our reading journals as sort of a replacement for worksheets, book reports, reading comprehension questions, those kinds of things that might be more typically done in history, literature, and science classes. Textbook free history post, which you can also listen to. It was a recent episode on the Homeschool Solutions podcast. So if you go to that link, you'll be able to either read or listen. You'll see that I talked about how we use this in our history a little bit, but you'll also see that with history, we really incorporate our science and our literature in a lot of ways. We are not really thinking of literature as being something separate from history, but as something that's being intertwined and interwoven. So what that ends up meaning is we can have one notebook that will include all of our responses to all of those subjects in one place. I get overwhelmed by too many things. I already have 5 children. I do not need 5 notebooks per child, per subject, floating around everywhere. Those are going to get lost. I'm going to get frustrated tripping on them. So my 2 older children just have one notebook. So this is my son's notebook. He still has space left in it from last year, so he'll continue using the same book this year. One of the things we loved about this particular style is it's divided into 3 sections, and there is lined pages. There's a section with graph pages, which is great for diagrams or things, and then the back is blank, which is great for drawing pictures related to the reading. But in years past, we've actually just used regular notebook paper, and it's just gone in their 3-ring binder. And then I've gone through and saved highlights at the end of the year. So really, you don't have to go get a fancy notebook, especially if you're just starting. Regular paper is just fine. Okay, well, before I talk a little bit about details, I thought I would read some excerpts to sort of show you a progression. So these are all things from my son. And I'm not going to show them to you because I don't want to embarrass him with any, penmanship or spelling. But I thought I would read so you could see 3 years in a row. So 3 years ago, he would have been 5th grade. He had an assignment of writing 5 sentences a week. And some of them were copy work and some of them were original thought. So this was in sort of that transition. My first reading journal post, that first model, it's all copy work. I don't require original thought in my young children. But as he was transitioning, some overlap, some copy work, some original thought. So this is something that he wrote. And you can, this is funny, the one I picked. I think I picked a lot of bloody ones, but hey, he's a boy. He really liked that part of his reading. Says here, if you were a Quaker, you would have had your forehead branded, your nostrils slit, your tongue bored, and your ears chopped off. If you started preaching again, you would be put to death. William Penn was a Quaker. Pennsylvania was named after him. And then there's like a space, a skipped line, and it says, Charles II claimed New Amsterdam, New York, and gave it to his brother James, Duke of York. So you can see a few things here. I am not, especially when they're first entering into this original thought, I'm not assigning this as a writing assignment. These are not like complete paragraphs where you have to have a good topic sentence and supporting details. I didn't require even the whole set of sentences to be related to one topic. It could be from maybe a couple different books or a chapter in a history book that made him think of several things. And that was totally fine. It was just more that total sentence, and also that I wanted him to start engaging with the author and responding to it. What stood out to him? Lots of freedom with these reading journals. It can be from nonfiction, from fiction, from combinations of the two, science. I just give a lot of freedom. And I think that I have seen the more freedom I've given my children and have just given like sentence or word counts or page lengths, they've been willing to write that more easily because they get to pick the things that stand out to him. I can pretty much guarantee you that my 5th grade girl would not have written that same paragraph and chosen such a bloody thing to write about. That same year, so this was 5th grade, one of his reading journal pages was a diagram that he did from his reading. I guess I will embarrass a little bit. It is kind of sloppy, but that was something he read about in his reading, and I allowed him to do that map work as his reading journal entry. So a little bit of foreshadowing here when I talk about details later on. The other thing is I encourage diagrams, charts. I think somewhere in here I have an example. One of them did actually a genealogy to kind of put all the like kings and queens and how they were related to each other in order. I think that's a very good use of a reading journal. Yes, Sarah, in the description, I found an example of the same notebook and then a similar notebook on Amazon. I dropped an affiliate link there. I can't remember. We actually found it at a local office supply store. We just walked in to try to find one that was going to work for the kids. I actually let them pick out their own design this past. They would be more likely to be motivated because it was their own choice. I did put the Amazon link in the description. So the following year, so again, that was the 5th grade example. The following year, 6th grade, he went from being required to do 5 sentences a week, some copy work, some original. The following year, we had a little bit of struggle at the beginning, but we finally found something that worked really well for his personality, and that was word count. He liked to have that mathematical, achievable goal, and so he also thought it was great that he got to type. So this was 6th grade, and he could type. He always would pick different fonts pretty much every week, and I gave him a weekly goal. And I didn't put the link for my big picture planning post. Need to remember to do that in the description. But one of the things that I talk about in my big picture planning post and video is that I have found that it works well to have a weekly goal that then they can break up through the week with the flow of the week. If we have like an extra field trip or someone gets sick, they have that whole week to accomplish a goal. So in 6th grade, he was given the goal, I think it was, depending on the week, it was 300 to 500 words a week. And again, it could be on anything he read, whether it was fiction, history nonfiction, science nonfiction, any of the more academic books. I didn't let him do it on Calvin and Hobbes, although, and that's fine, but I knew I wanted to challenge him. He was able to do this. Sometimes he would write one total paragraph with all those words on one topic. Sometimes you'll see a page from a week and it'll have several little mini, but the total word count would be the same. So here's an example, the deeds of the Second Triumvirate. The triumvirate was made up of 3 men, Mark Antony, Octavius Caesar, and Marcus Lepidus, a 60-year-old cavalry commander who fought under Julius Caesar. Their mission was to destroy anyone who they thought might be an enemy to them in Rome. Among those on their list was Cicero, the orator, and 2,300 other knights and senators, and so on. And he quotes something that was a reward, and then he goes, bloody but true. Again, he gets excited about those bloody things. There was a page written about Hadrian's Wall. You can tell that he also is really focusing on the nonfiction, which was fine with me. And then he wrote something about Julius Caesar and Gaul. So that was 6th grade. This past year, he started doing a humanities program. It was the same one that was incredibly formative in my own life. And so as part of humanities, which is a bigger vision of how philosophy and history and literature and all of these things really are all part of one big story. And so you're learning a lot of things all at the same time. And that worked out really well for his reading journal. He would have nonfiction and fiction assignments, and some science too that he ended up writing about. So I thought I would share a few examples from this year. Here is an example of a reading journal, not sentences. He was learning about the chivalric virtues, the chivalric code, and so he literally just wrote out the Latin and the English translations for the chivalric code. That was something that he was learning about. That was a very good use, in my opinion, of his reading journal. Lists are a great option, especially if someone's getting either bored of writing sentences, or maybe you have someone who doesn't like to write, or that's not an area of their strength. Writing lists is a great way, even lists of words, lists of key names, list of vocabulary that's new. Some of it is just that process of taking something you've read, thinking about it, and then producing your response, your thoughts onto a page. That habit and that way of thinking can be developed in many different ways for many different strength levels, difficulty levels, all those things. So I'm showing you some examples, but your reading journal with your children is going to look different because your children are different. And in fact, my daughter's looks different than my son's, and my other children's look different still. Then he really loved Dante, and I won't spend too much time here. You don't want to hear all his reading journals, but he wrote a page describing a certain circle of hell, and later on, so that was, I guess you would consider that fiction. That's, you know, a poem, epic poem. Later on, he wrote a page related to some history he was reading, some nonfiction. Some of it's factual, some of it's his opinions and thoughts. And then he also drew many, many diagrams of what he was reading about from the Inferno, where he labeled the different circles, and there's several pages of these different parts of the Inferno. And I was totally happy with him, you know, going back to the text. Again, this is another thing with a reading journal. It's elevating the text, elevating the author's intent, the importance of going to the text we're thinking about, or even just for the factual information of what did the author say. Well, show me where in the book that was. So for him to have to go back to the book and really read it closely in order to draw these diagrams and think about them, that's accomplishing the same goal as the times he wrote a paragraph about one of Dante's cantos. So, cantos? I get so confused about pronunciation. Okay, so now I'm going to show you an example from my daughter. This was her 5th grade year, and she is still working on different elements of original composition, not original thought, but the actual physical act of. And so I actually, and different from her brother at the same age, this year I still had her doing a lot of copy work and then some original thought as well. So there was a good combination of both. Here was something she wrote. John had been sending large sums of money to his allies in Flanders to harass King Philip of France. This they were doing with fire and sword. The blackened and ravaged countryside lay a barren wasteland of famine and death. So that was copy work. And I should mention, she gets to pick the sentences to copy. So I think she picked something that's beautiful, that's a very poetic description. And so it's always fun to see what they gravitate towards to copy. And then her original thought, that same day's journal, or that same week, the barons were very two-faced. They were very mad at King John, so they swore allegiance to France and England at the same time. I had to decipher some spelling there. And then she had one key fact she had learned, which was Marco Polo, 1254 to 1324. So if it comes to like a fact or a definition or a date, something like that, that they put in their reading journal, I encourage that and give them the freedom to do that as well. These have been primarily history and I guess literature. I didn't mark some of the science pages, but we do the same thing with science. And actually, that's going to be the primary method of me determining what my son has learned in his science this upcoming year. It was sort of his last year before high school. He had a lot of things he wanted to learn. He's going to be reading a lot of shorter books instead of one traditional textbook this year. And he's going to be keeping a science journal with both diagrams and sentences. That will also be what my daughter does in lieu of worksheets or any other more traditional notebooking exercises for her science this year. We will be reading it together. She'll be writing sentences and diagrams. So I've been reading examples heavy on history and literature, but I did want to make clear we do the same thing, and one can do the same thing with certainly with science. You could do it with Bible. You could, I don't know, what other things, philosophy, worldview, rhetoric, probably pretty much anything you really wanted to study, you could use a similar method, if not the same thing. Let's see. Is there anything else? I'll just stick with that from hers. And then I did promise a glimpse into a high schooler reading journal. So in my humanities, I was required, to write one reading journal page a day. Quite frankly, I didn't always quite get to that. Just like with my own children, you know, you set goals and you want them to be reasonable goals as best you know, and you want them to be challenging goals so that you have something to strive and work towards. But sometimes the reality is you don't quite get to them, and that's okay. Doing things well with joy and simplicity is good enough. So here's an example of something that was more literary from my high school. I was apparently reading Pride and Prejudice for school at the time. And I said, Jane Austen, okay, side note, I don't know if this is true or not. I haven't really read it that closely. This is from me as a high schooler, so please don't judge. Jane Austen was uses third-person limited omniscient to tell her story. Her perspective is primarily through the mind and heart of Elizabeth Bennet, the primary heroine of the novel. In this way, the reader can have insight into Lizzie's heart, aspirations, and dreams, primarily, while retaining a sense of the separateness of the other characters. Although there are many minor themes in this book, the major themes are those of marriage and class distinction. The theme of marriage is established from the opening line, while the central focus of the characters is the pursuit of marriage. This theme is further magnified in the lives of the 6 major couples. Austen compares and contrasts their motives for marrying, their philosophy toward their partners, and the happiness or lack thereof of their future. Blah, 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 blah. Each person in the novel is affected by a sort of moral blindness that keeps him from seeing himself and others as they really are. For example, Elizabeth is unable to see her own Pride and Prejudice because of her contempt for Darcy's. And that was an example of a reading journal from literature, like a traditional fiction. There was also a reading journal page I wrote on To a Louse by Robert Burns, which if you've never read that poem, you should. It's very funny. This amusing poem by Robert Burns is an admirable example of the products of the Romantic poets. First, it was given its wings by imagination. Burns went from seeing a louse on a lady's bonnet to creating a descriptive and laughable image to formulating a moral lesson from his observations. And I went on and wrote more. So hopefully you can see how you start very, very simple. You're starting with copy work, very little original thought. The original thought the children have is quite basic, and you're going to build and build every year, and for every child as an individual, challenging them to take that next step, whether that be longer or more sentences of original thought, whether that be maybe not just narrating back the facts of the story or the history or the science. Maybe it's starting to analyze a little bit more and looking more deeply into themes or characters, motivations, and such. So the reading journal, the way we have done it, I really feel like it grows with your children and slightly custom for any level or subject, which I like. Let's see. So we have the one journal. It's for all the subjects at once, all their responses all together. We do not do reading comprehension booklets. We do not do book reports. We do little to no worksheets. I am not a fan, and possibly if you have questions about that, I could do another Facebook Live or respond to you personally. But certainly when it comes to reading comprehension type things, I feel like instead of actually approaching honestly what the author is saying, you're being given questions to kind of go find something in the text. Plus, they just always bored me. And since I'm the teacher, I don't want to make my kids do it. And I should note, I didn't have to do them very often, but when I did not like them. Diagrams are allowed and encouraged. That could be a map, a chart, whatnot. This is not corrected for spelling or grammar or handwriting, as you obviously saw. The ultimate goal here is, again, them listening and learning and responding to what they've read. And also, alongside of that, it gives me as the teacher such a great tool to be able to go and read their journal entries and be able to spark some discussions there. Some of my children are more willing to talk to me about what they're thinking than others. And so for the children who, if I sat there with them and tried to talk to them about what they read, it would be monosyllabic. When I began the reading journal process, I saw all these thoughts that were happening under this. I realized they actually were enjoying and listening and learning. And it gave me a tool to read all these thoughts and be able to ask questions. So I saw that you mentioned this. Tell me more about this event. Or, wow, that's really scary. What was happening to the Quakers? Like, tell me more. What other kinds of gruesome activities are going on? So it's just an excellent tool as a teacher. It's not just for the student, but it builds that relationship and that communication. I know I've said this many times, and know your children. There have been times when I've asked too much of a child whose spelling is really, really hard for, and there was so much focus on trying to figure out how to spell words that the whole point of the reading journal was being lost. And so I had to reevaluate at that point, go back to more copy work. If you have a child who needs some prompts, feel free to give them prompts. There's nothing wrong with prompts. My children prefer no prompts right now, but I could see another child maybe really flourishing when given certain writing prompts. No matter what age your children are now, or when you start a reading journal habit, I encourage you to start small. I would hate for somebody to get all excited and take this back to their 8th grader, their 9th grader, their 10th grader this year and be like, I have this great idea and you're gonna write a whole page every day this week. If they haven't been used to this, they're not gonna buy into that, probably. So start small, start with manageable chunks. be willing to do copy work, even with older children, if this is totally out of their experience. You're going to want to build up the momentum and kind of get used to the habit before you shoot for the stars and try something too big and then you miss and everyone cries. I don't want any tears after this Facebook Live. Okay. If you have a more artistic kid, now I do not so far have a child who is like really wanting to draw all the time, but I keep hoping for one because I have all these really fun ideas for reading journal for a child who's maybe more artistic. So I will share these with you. Again, these are untested, but these are just some really fun ideas where you wouldn't have to write off a reading journal just because your child maybe has some sort of inability to write, you know, dyslexia, dysgraphia, or is like really into drawing and art. Here are some ideas I had. One is to narrate something they've read or had read aloud to them in a more comic strip or graphic novel style. So, you know, say I had read, you know, Pride and Prejudice. Well, instead of going and writing a page about it, what if I had drawn, you know, a scene from the novel, you know, a series of scenes to depict a plot or to depict a theme. And I think that would be actually really fun. I wish I could draw. I can't, but that would be a fun idea. Or you could even just have them draw, if they just wanted to draw one scene from what they had read. You could do this even with nonfiction. Let's say you've read about a certain battle in history, or you know, a queen ascending to the throne, and there's been drama, because there's generally drama in history. You know, have your child draw a really cool scene from something that struck them as they read. That's just as valuable if they're not able or don't care to write sentences. If that's a struggle, they're still getting that same habit of reading the author, thinking about the text, and then responding with their own original thought, even if it's in an image and not a sentence. Another idea is if you have someone who's kind of metaphorical thinker, maybe a philosopher, they could do some sort of even metaphorical image. It wouldn't have to necessarily be an actual literal picture of the events, but maybe some abstract art, and they could then talk to you about why that bit of abstract art really reflects what they were learning about from the text. And of course, there's always the maps, the diagrams, and the graphs, which my children use maybe once a week-ish. I don't want them to only be doing those. I do want them to be writing because they are good at that, and I want to challenge them in that way. But those are also really great ideas for a reading. Options. This is whether you're just getting started or have been doing reading journaling for a while, to write a list of characters, if it's fiction, or I guess even nonfiction really, to list out any new or unknown vocabulary that you or they come across in the reading, to write questions brought up by the reading. They don't always have to just write a statement. Let's say they're reading something and maybe they're not sure they agree, or maybe they read something and it makes them wonder, I wonder if this bit of science has an impact to this other thing I've been thinking about. Well, they could just write out the question, and I would encourage you to not make them have an answer necessarily. Just even write out a question from their reading is, again, that thoughtfulness. We really want them thinking, engaged in their reading. Also, kind of along with those questions, give them the freedom. Make sure they really know it's okay for them to not like what they're reading. If they're writing and they really didn't like the book, they can write in the reading journal, I did not like this book, you know, but then don't just let them stop there. Like, okay, oh, I'm so excited. Tell me more. Why did you not read? Like, make sure they don't just say, I hated it. It was terrible. I can't believe my mother made me read this. But instead, if they were thoughtful and like, I didn't like this book, I felt the descriptions were dry, or the ending didn't seem logical to me, or I didn't think the characters were consistent in their behavior. Or if it's science or history, like I felt like the author was quite biased and left out this other possibility. So even if they don't like what they're reading, it doesn't mean that they have nothing to say. It just gives them something interesting to respond to. Kind of is definitely going to be more with your much older children, most likely. I've still found that by middle school age, still are fairly factual in what they're thinking about when it comes to their reading. I haven't yet seen, I've started to see glimmers with my son of kind of wrestling with the text a little bit more, but for now, they're still fairly straightforward. So don't expect any kind of like crazy profound thoughts from your 11 or 12-year-old. But high schoolers definitely could start having some more engagement with the author. And finally, speaking of engagement with the author, I wanted to mention that I think it's important to have your children respect the author. And by that, I don't mean that they have to like it, obviously. And I don't mean that they have to buy into everything the author is saying. But the author is the one who wrote the words. So we need to honestly examine, kind of set aside our opinions for a moment, not to accept what the author is saying, but to listen to what the author is saying. So again, this is why we go back to the text and what does the author say? What did he mean by that? Well, let's start seeing what he actually said. And I think that this habit of journaling along as you read, not necessarily there with the pen and paper in hand, unless you prefer that, but the process of thinking through what you've read and responding to it and just describing it is very helpful for a form of textual criticism that is honest and respectful to the author. And that kind of goes into some of my opinions on literary study in particular. Anyone around Humility and Doxology knows that I love books and reading, and every Friday we do a book pairing challenge, and that's fun. If you follow Humility and Doxology on Instagram, I often share things we're reading, either in the stories or in my pictures. But in the description of this video, I put a link to my Don't Know Much About Literature post. And I've started writing a few posts that are really geared towards grown-ups who maybe feel like they didn't get a very good education, or there are things that maybe they never really liked, but they think they're supposed to like it. So I sort of took two different topics that I hear a lot of varied opinions about, math and literature, and I wrote posts to help get you, the grown-ups, excited about your own lifelong learning. So if you've heard this, oh dear, very long video, and you're thinking, really, I don't know, I have no background in any of this, I don't know how to read a book, how would I even know if what my kids are saying has anything to do with what they're reading? Go to that post and maybe try to read some of the books I recommend. Try thinking and stretching your own mind in this way. And definitely come back and let me know if you have any questions or thoughts. I feel like I've been talking and I'm out of breath. I had so many words to say and I didn't even realize it. And I still feel like I've probably left off something really important or obvious. So if you're watching the replay, feel free to drop questions or comments in the comment box, and I will make sure to come back and reply to those later. So thanks for sticking with me if you've stuck around this very long Facebook Live, and I look forward to talking with you all soon. Bye.